The night of February 27, 1942, was unusually calm in the Java Sea. Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman stood on the bridge of his flagship, the light cruiser De Ruyter, scanning the darkening horizon. Behind him steamed a desperate collection of warships, American, British, Dutch, and Australian vessels, hastily assembled to stop a Japanese invasion force heading toward Java. None of them knew they were about to encounter a weapon so advanced, so devastatingly effective, that it would fundamentally change naval warfare in the Pacific. A weapon that American intelligence had been warned about nearly 2 years earlier, but had dismissed as impossible. The Battle of the Java Sea would become one of the most catastrophic defeats in Allied naval history, and at its heart was a technological marvel that would confound American naval commanders for months to come. Ships were being torn apart by massive explosions from distances that shouldn't have been possible. Torpedoes were appearing seemingly out of nowhere, striking with devastating precision from ranges that exceeded anything in the Allied arsenal by a factor of 3 or even 4. As the sun began to set that February evening, Doorman's task force consisted of 5 cruisers and 9 destroyers. They faced a Japanese force of similar size, but the Japanese had something the Allies didn't know about, something that would turn the coming battle into a nightmare. At 1600 hours, the opposing forces made visual contact. The Japanese heavy cruisers Haguro and Nachi, along with the light cruiser Jinka and their destroyer escorts, began maneuvering into position. What the Allied commanders didn't realize was that Japanese doctrine called for immediate torpedo attacks at ranges that Allied officers would consider absurdly long. The Japanese destroyers and cruisers began launching their torpedoes from distances of 15, even 20,000 yards. That's nearly 9 miles. To put this in perspective, American torpedoes of the time had an effective range of about 6,000 yards, and even that was considered optimistic. The Allied commanders, seeing the Japanese ships at such extreme distances, had no reason to expect torpedo attacks. They assumed they were safe from such weapons until the range closed considerably. They were catastrophically wrong. The first Type 93 torpedoes, each one nearly 30 feet long, and carrying a warhead packed with over 1,000 pounds of high explosive, streaked through the water at nearly 50 knots. They left almost no wake. Their oxygen propulsion system, a technological achievement that American engineers would later admit they had never seen anything like, produced no telltale bubble trail that compressed air torpedoes created. The Allied lookouts had no idea death was racing toward them beneath the waves. At 17:28 hours, the Dutch destroyer Kortenaer simply exploded. One moment she was steaming in formation, the next moment a massive detonation broke her back. She sank in minutes, taking most of her crew with her. The Allied commanders were stunned. How had a torpedo reached them from such an impossible range? The immediate assumption was submarines. Japanese submarines must be operating in the area, launching torpedoes at the Allied formation. This assumption, though wrong, would persist for months and would lead to countless tactical errors that cost more ships and more lives. Admiral Doorman ordered evasive maneuvers to avoid what he believed were submarine attacks. This broke up his formation and prevented coordinated attacks on the Japanese surface force. The battle raged for 7 hours as Doorman repeatedly attempted to reach the invasion transports, and the Japanese surface forces maneuvered to block him. All the while, those long, wakeless torpedoes kept coming, launched from distances the Allies thought were safe. The heavy cruiser Exeter took an 8-inch shell hit that penetrated her boiler room, forcing her out of line. The British destroyer Electra went down fighting after making a brave but ultimately futile torpedo attack with her own inferior weapons. As darkness fell, Doorman's force was reduced. The American destroyers had to withdraw due to fuel and ammunition shortages, a result of the prolonged engagement. but Dorman pressed on with his remaining 4 cruisers, searching through the night for the invasion convoy. At 23:25 hours, the Japanese cruisers Haguro and Nachi, tracking the Allied force by radar, launched another spread of those devastating torpedoes from long range. 7 minutes later, one Type 93 struck the light cruiser Java. The explosion was catastrophic, igniting her ammunition magazines. Java blew apart and sank almost instantly, taking 512 of her crew to the bottom. Minutes later, De Ruyter herself was hit. The flagship erupted in flames and began to sink. Admiral Dorman went down with his ship, along with 344 of his men. The next morning, the heavy cruisers Houston and Perth, having escaped the initial battle, were intercepted in Sunda Strait by another Japanese force. Once again, the long lance torpedoes struck from impossible ranges. Both cruisers were lost. In less than 48 hours, the Allied naval presence in the Dutch East Indies had been effectively destroyed. 5 cruisers and several destroyers were gone, along with thousands of sailors. And the Allied High Command still didn't understand what had hit them. The mystery deepened over the following months. At the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sent to the bottom in a single night action. Again, torpedo hits from seemingly impossible ranges played a crucial role. At the Battle of Tassafaronga in November, a superior American force ambushed a Japanese supply run. The Americans got the first radar detection and opened fire with devastating effect. But then the Japanese destroyers launched their torpedoes. 4 American heavy cruisers were hit. 1 sank, and the others were severely damaged. The Japanese lost 1 destroyer. American commanders were beginning to realize they were facing something extraordinary, but they still didn't know exactly what. Reports from survivors spoke of massive explosions, of ships being hit by what seemed like multiple torpedoes when Japanese forces had been too far away to have launched them. The confusion was compounded by the fact that American torpedoes were notoriously unreliable at this stage of the war. They ran too deep, their magnetic exploders often failed, and their contact exploders were prone to shattering on impact without detonating. American submariners were reporting hit after hit that resulted in no explosions, while Japanese torpedoes seemed to work with devastating reliability. What the Americans didn't know, what they couldn't have known without examining an actual Type 93 torpedo, was just how far ahead of Allied technology the Japanese had leaped. The story of how they had achieved this begins in the early 1920s, when Japanese naval engineers began experimenting with oxygen as a torpedo propellant instead of compressed air. The advantages were immediately obvious, but extremely difficult to achieve safely. Oxygen is highly reactive. Any contamination, any oil or grease in the propulsion system could cause a catastrophic explosion. But if it could be made to work, the benefits would be revolutionary. An oxygen-propelled torpedo would leave virtually no wake. Compressed air torpedoes released bubbles as they ran, creating a visible trail that gave away their position and trajectory. An oxygen torpedo, burning pure oxygen with kerosene fuel, would produce carbon dioxide and water, both of which dissolved in seawater, leaving almost no trace. This made the torpedoes nearly impossible to spot until they were right on top of their target. More importantly, oxygen propulsion was vastly more efficient. It allowed for much longer range and higher speed, or alternatively, a much larger warhead. Japanese engineers spent years solving the safety problems. They developed special procedures for cleaning and maintaining the oxygen tanks and propulsion systems. They trained their torpedo crews in techniques that seemed obsessively careful to outside observers. Every component had to be absolutely free of any oil or organic contamination. The handling procedures were complex and time-consuming, but the result was a weapon that worked, and worked spectacularly. The Type 93 torpedo that emerged from this development program was a monster. At 29 feet long and 2 feet in diameter, it was larger than most Allied torpedoes, but that wasn't what made it special. Its warhead contained 1,100 pounds of high explosive, significantly more than American torpedoes of the time. But the real achievement was its performance. At its maximum range setting, a Type 93 could travel over 40,000 yards, that's more than 22 miles, at 36 knots. At higher speed settings, it could make 50 knots and still reach out to 20,000 yards. No Allied torpedo came close to these specifications. The Japanese Navy, recognizing what they had, made the Type 93 the centerpiece of their surface warfare doctrine. They trained their destroyer and cruiser crews relentlessly in nighttime torpedo attacks. Japanese destroyers were equipped with reloadable torpedo tubes, allowing them to fire, reload, and fire again during a single engagement. Their tactics called for aggressive closing maneuvers, overwhelming torpedo salvos, and then withdrawal before the enemy could effectively respond. In the early years of the Pacific War, this doctrine worked brilliantly. But there was a warning. In May 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor, a source, whose identity remains classified to this day, provided the United States Naval Attaché in Tokyo with detailed intelligence about the Type 93 oxygen torpedo. The information was accurate. It described the oxygen propulsion system, the extended range, the large warhead. It was all there. But American naval intelligence didn't believe it. The performance characteristics seemed impossible. Oxygen torpedoes were considered too dangerous to be practical. The Japanese, the thinking went, couldn't possibly have solved the safety problems. The intelligence was filed away and largely forgotten. This dismissal would cost the United States Navy dearly. When the war began and American ships started being hit by torpedoes from impossible ranges, there was no institutional knowledge to fall back on. The warning had been ignored. Commanders had to learn through bitter experience that the Japanese had a weapon that outclassed anything in the Allied arsenal. Month after month, the losses mounted. At Kula Gulf in July 1943, the light cruiser Helena was torn apart by multiple long lance hits. At Kolombangara, later that same month, 3 Allied cruisers were damaged by long-range torpedo attacks, despite having radar and numerical superiority. The question that haunted American naval planners was simple. How do we fight something we don't understand? Without knowing the capabilities and limitations of the Type 93, developing effective countermeasures was nearly impossible. The Allies needed to get their hands on one of these weapons. They needed to examine it, test it, understand it. But that was easier said than done. Torpedoes that hit their targets were destroyed by their own explosions. Torpedoes that missed generally sank to the bottom of the ocean, often in water too deep to recover them. The Type 93 was designed to sink if it reached the end of its run without hitting anything, preventing exactly the kind of intelligence coup the Allies needed. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, liberating islands and engaging in brutal amphibious campaigns, engineers and intelligence officers accompanying the assault forces began searching through captured Japanese installations. Torpedo workshops, supply depots, maintenance facilities all became targets for intelligence gathering. In some cases, damaged or partially assembled torpedoes were found and carefully shipped back to the United States for analysis. In other cases, torpedoes were recovered from wrecked or beached Japanese ships. The exact circumstances of the first intact Type 93 torpedo to fall into American hands are still somewhat unclear, but by 1943, American engineers had examples to work with. What they found when they disassembled and examined these weapons left them shaken. The level of engineering sophistication, the attention to detail, the sheer audacity of the design, all of it contradicted the prevailing American assumption that Japanese technology was inferior. that Japanese industry was incapable of matching Western engineering standards. The long-lance torpedo was proof that these assumptions were dangerously wrong. The oxygen propulsion system was the most obvious revelation. American torpedo designers had considered and rejected oxygen propulsion as too dangerous and too difficult to implement. The Japanese had not only implemented it, they had made it work reliably in combat conditions. The fuel management system, the combustion chamber design, the contamination prevention protocols, all represented years of careful development and testing. American engineers admitted they had never seen anything so sophisticated in a naval weapon. The range and speed specifications, once dismissed as impossible, were confirmed through testing. A recovered Type 93, refurbished and test-fired at a captured Japanese facility, performed exactly as the intelligence reports from 1940 had claimed. It could indeed reach out over 20 miles. It could indeed make 50 knots. And its warhead was indeed powerful enough to break the back of a heavy cruiser. Everything that had been dismissed as exaggeration or impossible was true. The size and power of the warhead was another shock. 1,100 pounds of high explosive, carefully shaped and positioned to maximize damage against a ship's hull, could create a blast that would tear through compartments, rupture fuel tanks, detonate ammunition magazines. A single hit could cripple a cruiser. Multiple hits could sink a battleship. American battle damage reports from ships that survived long-lance attacks showed damage patterns that were hard to believe. Entire sections of hull torn open, structural members shattered, watertight integrity compromised across multiple compartments. These weren't the relatively modest holes that American torpedoes produced. These were catastrophic wounds. The wakeless characteristic of the Type 93 was confirmed through careful observation. Oxygen combustion products dissolved in seawater with minimal trace. A Type 93 running at depth left only a faint disturbance, virtually impossible to spot, especially at night. This explained why Allied lookouts had failed to see incoming torpedoes even when they were looking in the right direction. There was simply nothing to see until the torpedo was right on top of the ship, and by then it was too late to maneuver. American engineers also discovered the reload capability built into Japanese destroyer and cruiser torpedo systems. This explained some of the confusion in battle reports. Ships that had observed Japanese destroyers launch their torpedoes and assumed they were no longer a threat had later been hit by additional torpedoes from those same destroyers. The Japanese could reload at sea during combat and bring their tubes back into action. This gave them a sustained striking power that Allied forces hadn't anticipated. The examination of captured long-lance torpedoes also revealed limitations and vulnerabilities, information that was just as valuable as understanding the weapon's strengths. The oxygen propulsion system, while highly effective, required extensive maintenance and careful handling. The Japanese Navy's obsessive cleaning and inspection protocols weren't just tradition or paranoia. They were absolutely necessary. Any deviation, any contamination could cause an explosion that would destroy the torpedo and possibly the ship carrying it. This gave American intelligence a potential vulnerability to exploit. If Japanese supply lines could be disrupted, if maintenance facilities could be destroyed, if trained torpedo crews could be eliminated, the effectiveness of the Type 93 would be degraded. The torpedoes also required very pure oxygen, which had to be produced by specialized equipment. Japanese oxygen production facilities became priority targets for American bombing raids and submarine attacks. Destroying or disrupting these facilities meant fewer torpedoes could be prepared for combat, and the ones that were prepared might not function properly if contaminated or lower-grade oxygen was used as a substitute. American engineers also noted that the Type 93, despite its impressive range, was still a straight-running torpedo. It didn't have active homing capability. Once launched, it ran in a straight line, or in some cases, a pre-programmed pattern. This meant that its effectiveness depended heavily on accurate firing solutions and the skill of the torpedo crews. Against maneuvering targets, especially if those targets knew torpedoes were in the water, hit rates would drop significantly. This became the basis for new American tactical doctrines. The revelation that the mysterious torpedo attacks weren't coming from submarines changed American tactical thinking. If surface ships were launching torpedoes from extreme range, then radar could provide early warning. American radar technology was superior to Japanese radar at this stage of the war. Ships equipped with modern radar could detect Japanese surface forces before visual contact and could track their movements. This gave American commanders the ability to anticipate torpedo launches and maneuver accordingly. New tactical procedures were developed and distributed throughout the fleet. When radar detected Japanese surface forces at long range, ships were to begin random evasive maneuvers immediately, not wait until torpedoes were visually spotted. The assumption had to be that torpedoes were already in the water. Zigzag patterns, speed changes, anything to make the firing solution more difficult and to create lateral separation from the predicted torpedo tracks. This simple change in procedure saved ships and lives. American destroyer tactics were also revised. Instead of keeping destroyers tied to cruiser formations as anti-aircraft and anti-submarine escorts, they were used more aggressively as independent striking forces. American destroyers, while their torpedoes were inferior in performance to the Long Lance, were equipped with radar and better gunfire control systems. Destroyers operating independently could close with Japanese forces, get their torpedoes into the water first using radar-directed firing solutions, and then engage with gunfire. The Japanese doctrine of nighttime torpedo attacks depended on surprise and superior optics. American radar negated both advantages. The Battle of Vella Gulf in August 1943 demonstrated the new American tactics. 6 American destroyers, operating without cruiser support, intercepted a Japanese destroyer force in the narrow waters of the Solomon Islands. Using radar, the American force detected the Japanese ships first, plotted their course and speed, and launched torpedoes before the Japanese knew they were there. When the American torpedoes started hitting, the destroyers opened fire with their guns, using radar-directed fire control. The Japanese force was devastated, losing 3 destroyers without inflicting any damage in return. The Type 93's advantages in range and power didn't matter because the Japanese never got a chance to use them effectively. This pattern repeated itself in subsequent engagements. At Empress Augusta Bay in November 1943, American destroyers again used radar to gain first detection and first attack. At the Battle of Cape St. George, later that same month, American destroyers detected, closed, and destroyed a Japanese force before the Japanese could bring their superior torpedoes to bear. The tactical situation had shifted. American technology and new doctrines had neutralized the Type 93's advantages. But the intelligence gained from captured Long Lance torpedoes had implications beyond tactical adjustments. American torpedo designers looked at their own weapons with new critical eyes. The Mark 15 torpedo, the standard American surface-launched weapon, had about half the range of the Type 93 and a smaller warhead. The Mark 14, used by submarines, was heavier and slower and had been plagued by reliability problems throughout the early war years. American torpedoes ran on compressed air or electric batteries. Neither could match the performance of oxygen propulsion. There was briefly serious consideration given to developing an American oxygen torpedo. Engineers studied the captured Type 93s in detail, examining the possibility of copying or adapting the design. But ultimately, the decision was made not to pursue oxygen propulsion. The safety concerns were real. The maintenance requirements were extensive. The training needed to handle the weapon safely would be time-consuming, and by late 1943, American forces were starting to win the Pacific War using their existing weapons once the reliability problems were fixed and tactics were adapted. The incremental advantage of an oxygen torpedo didn't seem worth the investment of time and resources. Instead, American designers focused on fixing the problems with existing torpedoes and developing new guidance systems. The magnetic exploder, which had caused so many failures early in the war, was finally fixed or deactivated. Contact exploders were redesigned to actually work when they hit targets. Depth-keeping mechanisms were calibrated properly. These fixes, combined with growing American industrial output, meant that American submarines and surface ships could overwhelm Japanese defenses with sheer volume of working torpedoes, even if each individual weapon was less sophisticated than the Type 93. American research also pushed ahead in areas where the Japanese had not focused. Acoustic homing torpedoes, which could track the sound of a target's propellers and make course corrections to maintain pursuit, started appearing in the American arsenal by late 1943. These weapons gave American submarines in particular a significant advantage. A homing torpedo didn't need a perfect firing solution. It could chase down a maneuvering target. The Type 93, for all its impressive range and power, couldn't do that. The impact of understanding the long lance extended beyond just the weapon itself. It forced American military and intelligence services to reassess their assumptions about Japanese technology and capability. The casual dismissal of the 1940 intelligence report had been a symptom of a broader problem, a tendency to underestimate Japanese engineering and industrial capacity. The Long Lance proved that Japan could produce world-class military technology, and in some areas, technology that surpassed anything the Allies had. This realization led to more careful and respectful analysis of other Japanese weapons and systems. Japanese aircraft, which had also been underestimated early in the war, were studied more carefully. The Zero fighter, the Betty bomber, the Kate torpedo bomber, all were recognized as sophisticated designs with specific advantages that had to be understood and countered. Japanese naval architecture, particularly their cruiser and destroyer designs, was examined with new appreciation for the thought and skill that went into them. The Long Lance also highlighted the importance of intelligence gathering and analysis. The 1940 warning had been ignored, and that ignorance had cost lives and ships. New procedures were implemented to ensure that intelligence, even intelligence that seemed unlikely or contradicted prevailing assumptions, was properly evaluated. Sources were protected more carefully. Technical intelligence, the examination of captured equipment and documents, became a higher priority. Teams of engineers and scientists accompanied combat forces specifically to search for and analyze enemy technology. As the war progressed and American forces advanced closer to Japan itself, more and more Japanese equipment fell into Allied hands. Torpedo workshops were captured with detailed manufacturing blueprints and quality control procedures. Engineers who had worked on the Type 93 program were identified and interviewed after Japan's eventual defeat. The full story of how the Long Lance was developed, the challenges that were overcome, the testing programs that validated the design, all of this became part of the historical record. What emerged was a picture of a weapon development program that, in its own way, was as impressive as the Manhattan Project or the development of radar. Japanese engineers had identified a theoretical advantage, oxygen propulsion, and had systematically solved every practical problem standing in the way of implementation. They had created manufacturing processes that could produce the necessary components to extremely tight tolerances. They had developed training and maintenance procedures that allowed the weapon to be used safely by ordinary sailors in combat conditions. They had integrated the weapon into a tactical doctrine that maximized its effectiveness. It was a complete system, not just a piece of hardware. The Type 93 represented the peak of Japanese naval weapon development. Later in the war, as Japan's industrial capacity degraded under the pressure of American bombing and submarine blockade, the quality of Japanese torpedoes declined. Oxygen purity decreased as production facilities were damaged. Trained maintenance crews were lost in combat and not adequately replaced. Manufacturing tolerances slipped as skilled workers were conscripted and factories were dispersed to avoid bombing. The Type 93 remained a dangerous weapon until the end of the war, but it never again had the overwhelming impact it had in the early campaigns. American engineers who examined the Long Lance after the war, when they had access to complete examples and full documentation, expressed a mixture of admiration and relief. Admiration for the engineering achievement, the elegant solutions to difficult problems, the attention to detail in every aspect of the weapon's design and manufacture. Relief that they hadn't tried to copy it during the war. The cultural and industrial differences between Japan and the United States meant that what worked for the Japanese Navy wouldn't necessarily have worked for the U.S. Navy. The obsessive maintenance requirements, the careful handling procedures, these fit well with Japanese naval culture and training. They would have been harder to implement in the American system, which emphasized standardization, ease of use, and tolerance for less than perfect maintenance. The Long Lance also became a case study in the relationship between technology and tactics. A superior weapon in the hands of forces using inferior tactics will lose to inferior weapons used with superior tactics. The early Japanese successes with the Type 93 came from a combination of excellent hardware and excellent tactical doctrine. When American forces developed tactics that negated the weapon's advantages, radar detection, aggressive destroyer employment, immediate evasive maneuvers, the balance shifted. The Type 93 was still dangerous, still capable of sinking ships, but it was no longer a war-winning weapon. In the post-war period, as the Cold War began and navies around the world modernized, the lessons of the Long Lance influenced torpedo development programs. The Soviet Navy, in particular, showed interest in long-range, high-speed torpedoes. Soviet designers developed their own oxygen torpedo systems, facing and solving many of the same problems the Japanese had dealt with decades earlier. The concept of the Long Lance, a massive torpedo optimized for surface warfare at extreme range, found new life in Soviet naval doctrine. American and British designers, meanwhile, focused on guidance systems and underwater speed, homing torpedoes, wire-guided torpedoes, and eventually torpedoes that could be launched from aircraft or dropped from helicopters. These represented different evolutionary paths from the straight-running, oxygen-powered Long Lance. But the fundamental lesson remained. Range, speed, hitting power, and reliability all mattered. A weapon that excelled in all four categories would dominate its tactical environment. For the men who fought in the surface actions of the Pacific War, especially in the dark nights around Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, the Long Lance was a weapon that earned their respect and fear. Survivors of ships torn apart by Type 93 torpedoes spoke of the massive explosions, the speed with which their ships sank, the difficulty of seeing or avoiding weapons that left no wake and could reach from impossible distances. These were sailors who had trained their entire careers on the assumption that naval combat would follow certain rules, certain ranges, certain predictable patterns. The Long Lance shattered those assumptions. The Japanese sailors who manned the torpedo tubes and launched the Type 93s in combat also had their own perspective. They had been trained on a weapon system that demanded precision and discipline. They knew that mistakes in maintenance or handling could result in catastrophic explosions on their own ships. They had seen what happened when contamination got into the oxygen system, or when proper procedures weren't followed. But they also knew they had a weapon that, when properly used, could change the outcome of a battle. The pride they took in their torpedo skills, the confidence they had in the Type 93's performance, these were central to Japanese naval culture in the early war period. As historians and military analysts have studied the Pacific War in the decades since it ended, the Type 93 Long Lance has taken its place as one of the most significant weapons of the conflict. Not because it won the war for Japan, it didn't. Not because it was invincible, it wasn't. But because it represented the intersection of technology, tactics, and training in a way that few other weapons systems did. It was a reminder that technological superiority in one area doesn't guarantee overall victory, but it can create opportunities that skilled commanders can exploit. The story of how American engineers captured a Japanese long-lance torpedo and admitted they had never seen anything so powerful is ultimately a story about humility and learning. It's about the danger of assumptions, the cost of dismissing intelligence, and the importance of understanding your enemy. The 1940 warning should have been taken seriously. The early battle losses might have been avoided or reduced if American commanders had known what they were facing. But once the lesson was learned, once the weapon was understood, American forces adapted. They developed new tactics, improved their own weapons, and ultimately gained the upper hand. The Long Lance remains a testament to Japanese engineering skill and naval expertise. In museums today, preserved examples of the Type 93 torpedo sit on display, their sleek forms and massive size still impressive more than 8 decades after they were built. Visitors can read the specifications, see the oxygen tanks and propulsion systems, and imagine what it must have been like to face these weapons in combat on a dark night in the Pacific. For those who were there, who saw ships disappear in massive explosions, who pulled survivors from oil-covered waters, who watched torpedoes streak past their own vessels by mere yards, imagination isn't necessary. They remember, and their testimony, preserved in oral histories and written accounts, ensures that the story of the Long Lance and the impact it had on the Pacific War will not be forgotten.